What if the most famous rivalry in human history had a different ending, one that was lost for 4,000 years? Imagine a clay tablet no bigger than your hand, still warm from the earth that held it, buried beneath desert sand for 4 millennia. The air above it is dry and still the kind of silence that only deep time can make. And pressed into its surface, in a script no living person could read for 2,000 years, is a story. The same two brothers, the same ancient rivalry, but an ending that changes everything you thought you knew. 4,000 years before anyone wrote Genesis, someone sat on a cool stone floor in a city called Nippur, dipped a reed into wet clay, and told this story differently. In their version, the farmer and the shepherd don't destroy each other. They find a way to share the same earth. So, what happened? What changed in the telling? Why did a story of cooperation, of sharing the same earth, become a story of taking life? Here's the thing. Nobody asked that question. We learn about Cain and Abel as if the story has always existed in its current form, as if the first act of violence between brothers was always there, written into the foundation of the world. But it wasn't. And tonight, we follow the evidence back to where it started. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are tonight and what time it is. Someone in Tokyo at midnight. Someone in London just past lunch. Someone in Sao Paulo as the sun comes up. Someone in California who should definitely be asleep by now. All listening to the same ancient words. I always read the comments. Tonight, we journey through 7 gates. From the Bible to Sumer, from clay tablets to the underworld, from the first farmer to the first death that may never have happened. We'll read what the actual tablets say. We'll meet the people who found them. A soldier clinging to a cliff face 300 feet above the ground. A quiet museum worker who was so excited by what he found that he started taking his clothes off in public. And we'll follow the oldest descent myth ever written. 7 gates of letting go, into a silence that's been waiting for you for 4,000 years. So, settle in, get comfortable. This is a long story, an ancient one, and there's no rush. The tablets have waited 4,000 years. They can wait for you to find the right position on your pillow. Let's begin where you already know the story. And then let's find out what came before. You know this story. Or you think you do. 2 brothers. The sons of Adam and Eve, the first family, if you follow the text. Cain, the older one, works the soil. He's a farmer. He builds, he plants, he puts down roots. Abel, the younger, tends flocks. He moves with the seasons, following grass and water. And right away, even before anything goes wrong, there's a tension here that's older than the Bible itself, the farmer and the shepherd, the one who stays and the one who moves, the one who builds walls and the one who needs open sky. Both brothers bring an offering to God. Cain brings fruit of the ground, the work of his hands. Abel brings the firstborn of his flock, and God accepts Abel's offering and rejects Cain's. The text never explains why. Here's the thing about this story: it's told in brutal economy. Fewer than 400 words in Hebrew. The entire arc of jealousy, confrontation, and consequence, compressed into a passage you could read in under 2 minutes. And yet it carries the weight of everything that follows in the biblical narrative. The first family, the first rivalry, the first time the ground received something it was never meant to hold. Cain's face falls, and God says something remarkable, something that sounds almost like a warning from a parent who sees a child about to make a terrible mistake. Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. That word sin appears here for the first time in the entire Bible. Not in the garden, not with the serpent. Here, between 2 brothers, described as something alive, something waiting, and Cain doesn't rule over it. The text doesn't dwell on what happens next. It moves through the act itself with a kind of terrible speed. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel. Abel's journey ended in a field. The soil that Cain had worked his entire life received something it was never meant to hold, and for a moment, just cold that silence, the silence of a field after something irreversible has happened. The wind still moves through the grain. The sky hasn't changed, but the ground knows. What follows is one of the most haunting exchanges in all of ancient literature. God asks, "Where is Abel, your brother?" And Cain answers with what might be the most quoted deflection in human history. Am I my brother's keeper? And then God says something that has echoed for 3,000 years. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Blood given a voice, ground given a memory. The earth itself becomes a witness. The consequence is precisely calibrated. Cain, the farmer, the one whose entire identity is tied to the soil, he is told that the ground will no longer yield its strength for him. The very thing that defined him now rejects him. He becomes a wanderer. A man who built everything on staying put is condemned to never stop moving. But here's what nobody tells you about what happens next. God doesn't destroy Cain. Instead, something unexpected, a mark. The mark of Cain. Not a punishment, as most people assume, but a protection. Whoever finds Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. The first act of divine mercy after the first act of ultimate consequence. And Cain's descendants, they don't disappear into shame, they become the inventors of civilization itself. Jabal, the father of tent dwellers, Jubal, the father of musicians, Tubal-Cain, the first metalworker, the forger of bronze and iron tools, craft and culture, intertwined from the very beginning, with the line that carries the weight of the first transgression. Meanwhile, Abel, remembered primarily through the harm done to him rather than the life he lived. His name means breath, vapor, something that vanishes almost as soon as it appears. And the questions that Genesis leaves unanswered are enormous. Why did God reject Cain's offering? The text never says. Who else populated the earth for Cain to fear? The text never explains. What was the mark? The text never describes it. 400 words and 3,000 years of people trying to fill in the gaps. But here's where the story gets truly strange. Because long before anyone wrote Genesis, long before Hebrew was even a language, someone else told this same story. On clay, in a script that would be completely forgotten for 2,000 years, and their version ends very, very differently. So here we are, with a story that fits in fewer than 400 words and 3,000 years of questions it refuses to answer. Why Cain's offering was rejected, who Cain feared out there in the world, what the mark looked like, what, exactly, it means that Abel's blood cried out from the ground. These aren't failures of the text, they're features of it. Genesis 4 is deliberately, almost aggressively sparse. It gives you just enough to feel the weight of what happened, and then it moves on. It trusts the silence to do the rest. And that silence has done extraordinary work. Thousands of years of theology, art, music, literature, all built on those 400 words. Cain and Abel have become shorthand for something primal in the human experience. The brother who builds, the brother who tends. The rivalry that ends the only way rivalries can end when there is no law, no court, no one watching except the ground. Or so we've been told. And if you've been holding on to what you thought you knew about this story, this is where you can start to let it go. Because what comes next changes everything. But before we go there, something important. What we're about to discover isn't about which version is right. It's not about proving one tradition wrong or another tradition superior. It's about something far more interesting than that. It's about how deeply human these questions are, so deep that cultures separated by 1,000 years and 1,000 miles kept asking them. The same rivalry, the same tension, the same two brothers, over and over. That's not a diminishment of any tradition. That's proof of how much these stories matter. They matter enough that humanity has been telling them for at least 4 millennia, and maybe longer. So, with that understanding, with the respect that a story this old deserves from every direction, let's go deeper. Because here's what nobody tells you. Long before anyone wrote the Hebrew Bible, long before Hebrew was even a spoken language, there existed a civilization, so thoroughly forgotten that for 2,000 years, nobody knew it had ever existed at all. Not the Greeks, not the Romans, not the medieval scholars who thought they knew the ancient world. An entire civilization buried under desert sand, with a literature that predates the Bible by a minimum of 1,000 years. And in that literature pressed into wet clay by scribes whose names we will never know is a story about a farmer and a shepherd. But their story ends differently, and that difference will keep you thinking long after tonight is over. Picture this. It's 1835. Western Persia. A young British Army officer is 300 feet above the ground, clinging to a cliff face that drops straight down into nothing. The wind is constant, hot, dry, pressing his shirt against his back like a second skin. His fingers find holds in the rock warm from the sun, rough-grained, crumbling slightly at the edges. Below him, the ground is invisible. Above him, carved into the cliff by a king who ruled 2,400 years ago, are 3 panels of symbols. Symbols that no living person on earth can read. His name is Henry Rawlinson. His hands are bleeding, and he has been coming back to this cliff, again and again, for months. The inscription is enormous. A royal proclamation carved into the rock at Behistun in 3 ancient languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and a third script that nobody recognizes at all. Rawlinson doesn't know it yet, but that third script, the one that looks like tiny wedge-shaped impressions pressed into stone, is the key to unlocking an entire forgotten world. He copies what he can reach. Ropes, scaffolding improvised from local materials, locals hired to dangle from the cliff and press wet paper against the rock, capturing impressions of symbols that have been weathering for 2,000 years. It takes him a decade, but he cracks it. Rawlinson and a handful of other scholars, working independently across Europe, decipher cuneiform, the oldest known writing system on Earth. And when they do, something extraordinary happens. The 1840s. British and French excavators in what is now Iraq begin digging, and they find things nobody expected. Enormous winged bulls carved from single blocks of stone, walls covered in cuneiform inscriptions, libraries. Actual libraries of clay tablets stacked in rooms that had been sealed for millennia. And then, beneath the Babylonian layers, beneath the Assyrian palaces and the Akkadian records, they find something even older, an entire civilization, deeper down, not mentioned in the Bible, not in any Greek or Roman text, not in any medieval chronicle, completely, thoroughly, absolutely forgotten. The Sumerians. Here's the thing about the Sumerians. They invented writing. They built the first cities. They created the first legal codes, the first schools, the first literature, and then they vanished so completely from human memory that for 2,000 years nobody knew they had ever existed. The gap between the Sumerian tablets and the Book of Genesis is roughly the same as the gap between us and the Roman Empire. Think about that for a moment. 1,000 years. The same distance between you, lying here tonight, and a medieval knight on horseback. That's how much older the Sumerian version is. And in those clay tablets in rooms that smelled of dust and ancient earth, when the excavators first broke through, they found stories. Familiar stories. Stories about a great flood. Stories about the first humans, stories about a garden, and stories about a farmer and a shepherd, the same farmer-shepherd question waiting beneath the sand. Letting go of certainty, because what they found down there, in the deepest layers, would quietly rewrite the origins of everything. If you're starting to drift, that's fine. Let the dust settle. Let the excavation happen in the background. The tablets are patient. They've been waiting. But before we read what the tablets say about our 2 brothers, we need to meet one more person. A quiet man in a London museum who is about to have the most dramatic moment in the entire history of biblical archaeology. Now picture a different room. It's November 1872. The reading room of the British Museum in London. Quiet. High ceilings. The smell of old paper and dust and lamp oil. The only sounds are the scratch of pens on paper and the occasional creak of a wooden chair. A man named George Smith is hunched over a clay tablet no bigger than his palm. George Smith is not what you'd expect. He's not a professor. He never went to university. He was a banknote engraver, a craftsman who carved intricate designs onto printing plates for a living. But he spent every lunch break at the British Museum teaching himself cuneiform from the tablets in the collection. He was so good at it, so obsessively, brilliantly, naturally good at reading these 4,000-year-old marks, that the museum eventually hired him. And now he's sitting here, reading fragments that most scholars have given up on, broken tablets, missing pieces, the archaeological equivalent of trying to read a novel that's been through a shredder. But today, something clicks. He reads a passage about a great flood, then another line about a boat, then animals, gathered in pairs, then a dove, sent out to find dry land, and George Smith realizes with a certainty that must have felt like the floor dropping out from under him that this tablet was written at least 1,000 years before anyone wrote Genesis. maybe 2,000. The story of Noah's flood pressed into clay, in a language that had been dead for millennia, was already ancient when the Bible was young. And George Smith, this quiet, methodical, self-taught genius, leaps from his chair. He begins rushing about the room and this is documented, this actually happened, a great state of excitement. Witnesses reported that he began to undress himself in the reading room of the British Museum. In 1872, a former banknote engraver, so overwhelmed by what a 4,000-year-old clay tablet had just told him, that he literally could not contain himself within his own clothing. That's what real discovery looks like. Not calm, not dignified, just a man and a tablet, and the sound of buttons hitting the floor. The aftermath was global. Smith published his findings. The Daily Telegraph funded an expedition to Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital where the tablet had been found, and Smith himself went. He found the missing piece of the flood narrative within days. The story was confirmed, and the world had to reckon with a strange, uncomfortable, magnificent truth. The Bible's stories had older, stranger twins. The cliff face Rawlinson climbed gave us the key. The tablet Smith found opened a door, and behind that door was a world where the familiar stories, the stories we thought we knew, the stories we told our children, the stories we built civilizations around turned out to be echoes. Echoes of something older, much older. And if you're lying in the dark right now, drifting in and out of these words, that's exactly right. You're hearing echoes too. Echoes of echoes. Words that travelled 4,000 years to reach you tonight. But the flood wasn't the only parallel. There was another story in those tablets. A farmer, a shepherd, a rivalry, and an ending that changes everything we think we know about the first brothers. That story is next. Here's what makes this remarkable. Among those tablets, the tens of thousands of clay fragments pulled from beneath the ruins of Mesopotamia, is a text, dating to at least 2,100 BCE, more than 4,000 years old, and it tells the story of a farmer and a shepherd. The farmer's name is Enkimdu. He tends the canals and the grain fields, the irrigation channels that turn desert into abundance. The shepherd's name is Dumuzi. He moves with his flocks across the open land, following grass and water and the turning of seasons. And both of them want the same thing, the love of a goddess named Inanna. Now, picture this. It's roughly 2,100 BCE. The city of Nippur, one of the oldest cities on Earth, built where the Euphrates bends through flat, wide farmland. In a small room attached to a temple, a boy of about 12 sits cross-legged on a cool stone floor. The air smells of wet clay and lamp oil. A small flame flickers in a clay dish, throwing long shadows against mud brick walls. In his right hand, he holds a reed stylus sharpened to a wedge-shaped point. He's a student in what the Sumerians call an ejiba, a tablet house, a school. And tonight his assignment is to copy a story, line by line, word by word, pressing the reed into a soft tablet of river clay, creating the tiny wedge-shaped impressions that we now call cuneiform. The story he's copying is the one we're about to hear, the farmer and the shepherd, the argument over Inanna, and a resolution that no one in the modern world expected to find. He doesn't understand all the words. Some of the vocabulary is already ancient in his own time, phrases and forms that predate even him by centuries. But his teacher insists, copy every line. Don't change a word, because these words matter. 4,000 years from now, someone lying in the dark will hear these same words, and drift towards sleep while listening to a story that this boy is carefully, painstakingly pressing into clay by the light of a single flame. He doesn't know that. He just knows his hands are tired and the clay is getting firm. Here's the thing about this particular text. In the story, Inanna, the goddess of love, of war, of the morning and evening star, is being courted by both men. Her brother, the sun god Utu, favours Dumuzi the shepherd. Dumuzi can offer milk and cream, fine wool, the wealth of the open pastures, but Inanna initially prefers the farmer. Enkimdu offers bread, beer, fine linen cloth, and the stability of irrigated land. And so the two men stand before a goddess, not with weapons, not with threats, but with lists, with arguments about whose way of life is better, whose contribution matters more. Dumuzi lists what he can provide. My milk is better than your beer. My cream is better than your butter. My wool is better than your cloth. It reads, honestly, like the oldest recorded sales pitch in human history. The same tension, the same binary, the shepherd who moves and the farmer who stays, freedom and stability, mobility and permanence. The same story that Genesis would tell, 1,000 years later, about two brothers named Cain and Abel. But here's where it gets different. Fundamentally, irreversibly different. And if you've been following the tension between these two, the farmer and the shepherd, the settler and the wanderer, this is where you can let go of expecting conflict. Because in the oldest version of this story, something unexpected happens. Something the later version never allows. 1,000 years of separation. The gap between these Sumerian tablets and Genesis is roughly the same distance as the gap between us and the Crusades. A millennium, different language, different culture, different world, and yet the same two characters. The same rivalry. The same question about how different ways of living can share the same earth. But the answer they found 4,000 years ago is not the answer you know. Enkimdu the farmer looks at Dumuzi the shepherd, the man who has been listing all the reasons why his way of life is superior, and says something that has survived 4,000 years on clay. Why should I compete with you? Your sheep can graze on my harvested fields. Your flocks can drink from my irrigation canals. In Uruk, farmer and shepherd can live in peace. Not violence, not death, not even argument really. Just accommodation. 4,000 years ago that was enough. An acknowledgement that these two ways of surviving need each other. That the milk and the grain, the wool and the linen, the open pasture and the irrigated field, they're not competing claims on the world. They're complementary parts of the same world. And when Dumuzi hears this, something remarkable happens. He doesn't press the attack. He doesn't insist on winning. Instead, he invites Enkimdu to his wedding feast. The shepherd invites the farmer to celebrate. And Enkimdu agrees. The text ends with a banquet, a table shared, wheat and barley exchanged for milk and cheese, two men who could have destroyed each other, choosing instead to eat together. Here's the thing. For at least 1,000 years before anyone wrote Genesis, this is how the story ended. Not with blood crying out from the ground, not with a mark of protection after an irreversible act, but with a handshake, with shared water, with the radical, practical idea that two different ways of surviving don't have to destroy each other. So what happened? What changed in the telling? Why did a story of cooperation become a story of taking life? What did memory add across those 1,000 years of retelling, reshaping, translating from one tongue to another? What turned a shared meal into a field where only one brother walks away? That question is going to stay with us for the rest of tonight. And it may stay with you longer than that. Wherever you are tonight, whether it's midnight or dawn, you're hearing the same words that someone on the other side of the world is hearing right now. And the question we just asked, it's been asked for 4,000 years. In different languages, by different voices, but always the same fundamental wonder. Why do stories change? And what do those changes reveal about the people who changed them? And if that feels like a heavy question for the middle of the night, it isn't. Because the fact that you're asking it at all means you're part of an unbroken chain of people who cared enough to notice. 4,000 years of people lying awake, wondering about the same thing. You're in good company tonight. The tablets we're drawing from were found in fragments in Ur, in Nippur, in the ruins of Uruk. Some are damaged, some are incomplete. Some are copies of copies, made by students in those scribal schools centuries after the stories were first composed. What survives is a patchwork. But even in that patchwork, the narrative is remarkably clear. Inanna's brother Utu speaks first. He tells his sister that the shepherd Dumuzi is the better match. Dumuzi has oil where the farmer has oil. Dumuzi has milk where the farmer has beer. Dumuzi has wool where the farmer has linen. But Inanna pushes back. The farmer brings me bread and beer, she says. He brings me fine cloth. He brings me the things that come from settling down, from building, from staying. Here's what nobody tells you about this exchange. It's not a love poem. Not really. It's an economic argument, formalized into narrative. The tablets use remarkably specific agricultural vocabulary, irrigation terms, grain measurements, seasonal cycles. These weren't abstract myths being told around a fire. They were sophisticated arguments about resource allocation, dressed up in the language of courtship, possibly the oldest recorded debate about which economic model is superior, the pastoral or the agricultural, and instead of resolving it with a winner and a loser, the tablets resolve it with integration. The flocks graze the harvested fields, the irrigation channels water the pastures, the shepherd's mobility and the farmer's permanence become parts of the same system. Symbiosis, written in clay, 4,000 years ago, and there's something else worth noting. These tablets carry traces of being very, very old, even by the standards of their own time. The Sumerian language in which they're written had multiple dialects, and some of the phrasing in these texts is archaic, which means the stories themselves are likely older than the tablets, older than the copies, older than the schools where students learned to write them down. We're not reading the original, we're reading what survived, and what survived was filtered through centuries of copying, teaching, and retelling each generation, pressing the same reed into fresh clay, carrying the words forward. And here's the part that stays with me. Some scholars believe that darker versions of these stories may have existed, versions where the rivalry didn't end peacefully, versions that were lost or deliberately set aside or never copied by the scribes who chose which stories to preserve. We'll never know for certain. What we have is what someone decided to keep. That boy in the Aduba, sitting on the cool stone floor in Nippur, copying line after line by lamplight. He's pressing these exact words into clay right now. He doesn't understand all of them. Some of the grammar is already old-fashioned in his time, the way Shakespeare feels old-fashioned to a modern teenager. But his teacher said, copy it all, every word. Don't skip a line. And so, he didn't. And because he didn't, we can read them tonight. 4,000 years of hands passing the same words forward. And now they're here, in the dark, with you. Not violence, but accommodation. Not death, but mutual benefit. For at least 1,000 years, the oldest version of this story ended this way. The farmer and the shepherd, the one who stays and the one who moves, a shared table. The recognition that both ways of living had value. The quiet, practical wisdom of people who knew they needed each other. But Sumerian stories rarely stay simple. Because Inanna, the goddess who chose Dumuzi, who married the shepherd Inanna, also had a shadow. And that shadow is where the story goes next. In other Sumerian texts not about farmers and shepherds, but about gods and the underworld, Dumuzi the shepherd meets a very different fate. Not at the hands of his rival, not because of jealousy or rejected offerings, but because of a divine bargain, a debt that had to be paid. Inanna descends to the underworld, and when she returns she must send someone to take her place. And she chooses Dumuzi not out of hatred, but because she found him feasting while she suffered. Because he failed to mourn her absence. The shepherd's journey ended not by a brother's hand, but by a goddess's judgment. And the mourning that followed the rituals, the songs, the seasonal laments lasted for centuries. Every summer, when the heat dried the land and the flocks grew thin, the people mourned Dumuzi's descent into darkness. And here's the deeper parallel buried in all of this. Abel too was a shepherd, and the earth remembers both. If your eyes are getting heavy, that's perfect. The story will be here whenever you come back to it. Right now, we're about to descend into the oldest underworld story ever written, and if you happen to fall asleep along the way, that's exactly where we're going. 7 gates, each one a little deeper, each one a little quieter, each one asking you to let go of something, because what comes next is the heart of everything. And here is where the oldest surviving descent myth begins. Older than Orpheus descending into Hades, older than any Greek journey into the realm beyond. This is the story of Inanna, Queen of Heaven, goddess of love and war, deciding to visit the underworld, the land of no return, the kingdom of her sister, Ereshkigal, goddess of the deep earth, of the silent places beneath the ground. No one knows exactly why Inanna goes. The tablets hint at several reasons: grief for a fallen companion, curiosity, ambition, a desire to understand the one realm she does not rule. Whatever the reason, she dresses in her full regalia. The crown, the jewelry, the garments of divine power, and walks toward the gates of the underworld. And at each gate she is stopped, and at each gate she must give something up. The first gate, the gatekeeper says, "Remove your crown." Inanna asks why. "Be silent. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned." And so the crown comes off, the symbol of authority, of power, of being in charge, letting go of authority, of the need to be in control, of the voice that says you should still be awake, still productive, still managing something. The second gate. Remove your lapis lazuli necklace, the stone of the sky, of beauty, of how others see you, letting go of appearance, of the curated self, of the face you show the world. The third gate. Remove your double strand of beads, accumulated treasure, gathered over a lifetime, letting go of accumulation, of what you've collected, the tasks, the worries, the things you think you need to hold on to until morning. Each gate described in the tablets follows the same pattern, a demand, a question, the same answer. Be silent. The ways of the underworld are perfect. And another piece of armour removed, and with each gate, the light dims, the air grows cooler, the sounds of the world above fade a little more, the silence deepens. 3 gates down. The crown of authority, gone. The necklace of beauty, gone. The beads of accumulation, gone. And 4 more gates ahead, each one deeper, each one quieter, each one asking Inanna and perhaps you to let go of one more thing. And if you can feel it, that gentle loosening that's not just mythology, that's 4,000 years of human wisdom about what it means to descend into the earth, into the quiet, into the place where everything you carry is finally, gently set down. The tablets knew something about sleep that we're only now beginning to understand, that it isn't something you do, it's something you allow, by letting go, 1 gate at a time. 4 more gates, and they go deeper still. The 4th gate. Remove your breastplate, the armour, the thing you wear to protect yourself from the world, the invisible shield you carry through the day, the composure, the readiness, the alertness that says, I am prepared for whatever comes next, letting go of protection, of the armour we wear. The 5th gate. Remove your gold bracelet, gold, the metal that doesn't tarnish, the symbol of things that last, of time itself, hours counted, schedules kept, alarms set for morning, letting go of time, of measuring and counting, of knowing what hour it is, or caring. And perhaps, right now, you've been letting go too, layer by layer, the worries of the day, the tension in your shoulders, the plans for tomorrow, 1 gate at a time, until there's just the sound of this voice. And even that will fade eventually, and that's exactly as it should be. The 6th gate. Remove your measuring rod, the tool that tells you how far you've come, how far you have left to go, the instrument of certainty, letting go of certainty, of knowing how the story ends, of needing to know. The 7th gate. Remove your final garment, letting go of everything, standing in the darkness with nothing. Inanna stands before the judges of the underworld, bare, silent, stripped of every symbol of who she was above. Crown, jewels, armour, gold, certainty, measurement, covering, all gone, all left at gates behind her. And here, in the deepest place, the oldest surviving text tells us something remarkable. The universe falters, because the goddess of life has entered the realm of ending, and the two cannot occupy the same space. The judges fix her with the eye of death. Not violence, the tablets are careful about this. It's described as a look, a gaze, a weight that presses the divine spark out of even a goddess. And Inanna's light goes out. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world above holds its breath. Crops wilt. Animals refuse to mate. The cycle of life itself pauses waiting. But the story doesn't end there, because Inanna has planned for this. A faithful companion sounds the alarm. The gods intervene, and Inanna is brought back from the deepest gate, returned to the world of light. But at a cost. Someone must take her place. That is the rule of the underworld. No one leaves without a substitute, and when Inanna returns to the world above, she finds Dumuzi, her shepherd, her husband, feasting while she was in the darkness, celebrating while she suffered, sitting on her throne as if she would never return. She fixes him with the same gaze, and the gala, pitiless, relentless creatures that know neither food nor water nor mercy take him down. Here's the thing about Dumuzi's fate. It's not about cruelty. It's about a cosmic debt that had to be paid. And for centuries afterward, for hundreds of years across Mesopotamia, people mourned his descent. Every summer, when the heat dried the land and the flocks grew thin, the people sang songs of lament. For the shepherd who went down into the dark, seasonal rituals, ceremonial weeping, the earth itself marking the loss of the one who tended it. And the ground remembers. It has always remembered. Dumuzi the shepherd, descending into darkness. Abel the shepherd, his journey ending in a field. Different stories, different centuries, different languages, but the same role, the same loss, the same earth that receives them both. And now we know both versions. The Sumerian, where farmer and shepherd find accommodation, but the shepherd's fate is sealed by a goddess's judgment, not a brother's hand. And the Hebrew, where the taking of life happens in a field, between brothers, no cosmic bargain, no divine debt, just jealousy and silence, and the ground crying out. Two stories, same characters, one ends in cosmic balance, the other in something far more human, far more troubling, and the question deepens, what changed, and why? But before we follow that question into its deepest layers, there's something hidden in the names themselves, something you can only see if you read the original languages. And what you find there is a kind of spell. Names in the ancient Near East were never just labels. They were compact little stories, miniature spells pressed into language. Picture a scribe, not the Sumerian student we met earlier, someone later, centuries later. Working by lamplight in a small stone room, the air smells of ink and dried papyrus, and the faint sweetness of olive oil burning in a clay dish. Outside, the sounds of a city settling into evening. Inside, just the quiet scratch of a reed pen on animal skin. He's copying a story he believes is sacred, word by word, letter by letter. And when his hand forms the name Hevel, the name we know as Abel, he's writing the Hebrew word for breath, vapor, mist, something that appears for a moment, catches the light, and then vanishes. The same word appears in Ecclesiastes, the book of wisdom written centuries later. Hevel havlim, the preacher says. All is Hevel, all is breath, all is vapor, all passes. Abel's name is his destiny, a life that vanishes almost as soon as it appears, a shepherd whose flocks wander, whose sacrifice rises as smoke and disappears into the sky. Everything about him is impermanence. Movement. The thing you cannot hold. And then there's Cain, Qayin in Hebrew. The surface meaning comes from the verb kana, to acquire, to possess, to gain. Eve herself names him. I have acquired a man with the help of the Lord. Acquisition, getting, holding. But here's what nobody tells you about the name Qayin. Some scholars, and this is debated, and that's part of what makes it fascinating, trace echoes of the name to an older Sumerian root, in, associated with craft, with metalwork, with the making of things. And Cain's descendants in Genesis, they aren't just wanderers cursed by God. They become the fathers of civilization itself. Jabal, the father of those who dwell in tents. Jubal, the father of music. Tubal-Cain the first to forge tools of bronze and iron. Craft and culture and construction, all flowing from the line of the one who took a life. Acquisition, building, making permanent, that's Qayin, breath. Vapor, passing through, that's Hevel. One name speaks of holding on, the other of letting go. One name builds walls, forges metal, plants crops that stay rooted in the soil. The other tends flocks that wander, offers sacrifices that turn to smoke, lives a life so brief that even his name is a sigh. Here's the thing, these aren't just names. They're the entire story compressed into two words. The farmer who acquires and the shepherd who breathes. The one who makes things last and the one who embodies the truth that nothing does. Letting go of holding on, acquisition and breath, what we try to keep and what passes through our fingers regardless. Like a name pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. Like a voice drifting through the dark to someone who may already be asleep. And that boy in the Aduba, the one we met earlier, pressing his reed into wet clay on a cool Nippur evening 4,000 years ago, he was both. He was Qayin in that moment, making something permanent, building a record, pressing words into clay so they would survive longer than the hand that wrote them. And he was also Hevel, a breath, a life, a boy whose name we will never know, who finished his lesson and walked out into a Sumerian evening, and lived a life that left no trace except these tablets. These words, carried forward by other hands, other voices, other students sitting on cool stone floors in cities that no longer exist. His tablet survived. His words are here tonight, in the dark, with you. Acquisition and breath. What we build and what passes through us. The same tension the story has always been about, from Sumer to Genesis to tonight. And the question that's been building since the beginning is almost ready to be asked directly. Acquisition and breath. What we build and what passes through us. If the name Qayin does carry an echo of an older root Sumerian, Mesopotamian, if it preserves a memory of a time when the farmer was not just a tiller of soil, but a culture hero of craftsmanship, then the names themselves are older than the story that contains them, fossils of meaning, embedded in syllables. And here's what stays with me. Different languages, different centuries, different civilizations separated by the width of a millennium, and yet the same metaphors keep arriving. The farmer builds, the shepherd moves. The one who stays wants to hold the world in place. The one who moves understands that nothing stays. Both necessary, both incomplete, both true. In Sumer, the resolution was practical. The farmer says, "Your sheep can graze my fields, my canals can water your pastures. We need each other," and they sit down to eat together. In Genesis, there is no table, no shared water, no accommodation, just a field, and silence, and the ground crying out. Here's the thing that's been building this whole time. In Sumer, the farmer and the shepherd found a way to coexist. In Genesis, one takes the other's life. Same characters, same tension, same ancient binary of acquisition and breath, of building and moving, of permanence and impermanence. Different ending. Why? What changed in the telling? Across those 1,000 years of retelling Sumerian clay to Akkadian tablets, Babylonian libraries to Hebrew scrolls, what was added? What was transformed? What did memory do to a story about sharing and turn it into a story about loss? Think about that gap. 1,000 years, the same distance between us and the Crusades. Enough time for a language to die and be reborn. Enough time for cities to rise and fall and be buried and forgotten. Enough time for a story to transform completely, and for nobody alive to notice the change. The murder that memory added. That's what we're looking at. Not a story that was always violent, but a story that became violent. A cooperation that was rewritten as a taking of life. And the question of why that question is worth following into the evidence. Because there are answers, not certain ones, not the kind that close the book and put it back on the shelf, but the kind that open doors, the kind that make you see familiar stories in a light you didn't expect. And that light is where we're going next. So let's follow the evidence, not to prove anything, just to see where the fingerprints are. The first thing to understand is that stories don't travel on their own. They need carriers. And between ancient Sumer and biblical Israel, there were plenty. Trade routes. The same dusty roads that carried copper and textiles and lapis lazuli between Mesopotamia and the Levant also carried words. Merchants who spoke multiple languages, translators who moved between courts, scribes who copied foreign texts because knowledge had value, because knowing what your neighbours believed was a kind of power. Here's what makes this plausible. We know from archaeological evidence, from the tablets themselves, that Mesopotamian stories were already spreading before the Hebrew Bible was written. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains the flood story George Smith found, has been recovered in fragments from at least 6 different ancient sites. The stories travelled, but they didn't travel unchanged. Every culture that received a story reshaped it, added local details, removed what didn't fit, emphasized what mattered to them. The bones stayed the same, a farmer, a shepherd, a rivalry, but the flesh changed. Theory 2. Conquering armies. When the Babylonian Empire conquered the Assyrians and absorbed their libraries, thousands of tablets, centuries of accumulated literature, those stories entered a new political context. What had been Sumerian became Babylonian. What had been Babylonian would, eventually, reach Hebrew ears. Theory 3. And this one has the strongest scholarly support. The Babylonian exile. Roughly 586 BCE, the kingdom of Judah falls. Jerusalem is destroyed. The educated elite, the priests, the scribes, the keepers of tradition are taken to Babylon. And there, in the very heart of Mesopotamia, surrounded by the oldest library in the world, surrounded by tablets containing stories that look remarkably like their own, they write, they compile, they edit. What we now call the Torah begins to take its final shape in exile, surrounded by Babylonian stories, influenced by them, reacting to them, sometimes borrowing from them, sometimes deliberately rewriting them. Here's the thing. If you're a Hebrew scribe in Babylon, and you encounter a Sumerian story about a farmer and a shepherd who find accommodation, and your own tradition already contains a story about brothers in which one takes the other's life, the question isn't whether the stories are connected. The question is what you choose to do with the connection. And maybe, and this is speculation, but it's informed speculation, the Hebrew version isn't a corruption of the Sumerian one. Maybe it's a response, a theological argument. The Sumerians said cooperation was possible. The Hebrew tradition said, yes, but look what happens when it fails. Look what happens when sin is crouching at the door and you don't rule over it. Not a lesser story. A darker one. A more honest one, perhaps, about what humans are capable of when sharing breaks down. Theory 4. The agricultural revolution as context. Cooperation works when there's enough land, when there's enough water, when the farmer's fields and the shepherd's pastures don't overlap, but population grows, cities expand. The land that once supported both becomes contested. And when resources shrink, the story that made sense, the story of sharing, starts to feel naive, inadequate, and the story changes to match the new reality. A rivalry that ends in accommodation becomes a rivalry that ends in loss, because that's what the world now looked like. And here's what makes this truly remarkable. It's not just Sumer and Israel. The same pattern appears across cultures separated by oceans. In Egypt, Osiris, the shepherd king, betrayed by his own brother Set. In Greek mythology, tensions between pastoral and agricultural deities woven into the foundations of their cosmology. In Vedic tradition, similar farmer-shepherd tension myths, embedded in some of the oldest texts in the world. None of these prove direct transmission. The stories may have travelled, or they may have been invented independently, the same human tension producing the same narrative structure in culture after culture after culture. But either way, they reveal something deeper. That this story, the farmer and the shepherd, the one who stays and the one who moves, the brother who builds and the brother who breathes, lives in the DNA of every civilization that ever planted a seed and watched it grow. We may never know exactly when the cooperation became a taking of life. We may never identify the scribe who made the change, or the generation that accepted it. The evidence gives us shadows, fingerprints, the outline of a transformation that happened slowly, over centuries, in languages that died and were reborn and died again. But we can see it, and seeing it changes how you hear the story, because now you know. It wasn't always this way. The violence was added, the murder that memory added. And that brings us to a question that's closer to home than you might think. Because the tension between the farmer and the shepherd didn't end 4,000 years ago. It's still here. The farmer-shepherd tension didn't end 4,000 years ago. It's still here. You're living in it right now. Urban and rural, the same tension, different vocabulary. The people who build upward apartments, offices, infrastructure, systems, and the people who spread outward farms, open land, the places where the sky is still bigger than anything humans have made. And between them, the same quiet argument that Dumuzi and Enkimdu had on the plains of Sumer. Whose way of life matters more? Whose contribution is essential? Tech and tradition. Move fast and break things, that's acquisition. That's Qayin. Build, disrupt, make the new thing, push forward regardless. And on the other side, preserve what works, maintain, tend what you have. Don't break something that took generations to grow. That's breath. That's Hevel, settled and mobile. Own a house or live anywhere. Put down roots or keep moving. Build a life in one place or carry it with you. The same question Dumuzi and Enkimdu asked, how do we live together when our ways of surviving are so different? And here's what 4,000 years of evidence suggests. The question has never been fully answered. Not in Sumer, where cooperation worked as long as the land was abundant. Not in Genesis, where the answer was violence and exile. Not in any civilization since, including the one you're lying in right now, unable to sleep, wondering about ancient brothers. The question isn't something to solve, it's something to hold. Wherever you are tonight, in a city apartment or a quiet suburb, restless or nearly asleep, alone or with someone sleeping beside you, this question is yours too. It's been yours since before anyone could write it down. And the fact that you're still asking it, that a story about a farmer and a shepherd from 4,000 years ago can still make you think, can still make you feel something in the dark, at whatever hour it is where you are, that tells you something. It tells you the story is alive, still, after everything. 4,000 years ago, people lay awake worrying about the same fundamental question we still ask. How do different ways of living share the same earth? The question hasn't changed. But maybe knowing that it's been asked for 40 centuries makes it feel a little less heavy tonight. You're not the first person to lie in the dark wondering about this. You won't be the last. And somewhere on the other side of the world, right now, someone else is hearing these same words, wondering the same things. Part of the same unbroken chain of people who cared enough to ask. You're in good company tonight. You always have been. Letting go of wakefulness. The 7 gates are behind us now. Every assumption stripped away. Every layer of what you thought you knew gently released. The crown of authority, the necklace of beauty, the beads of accumulation, the armor of protection, the bracelet of time, the rod of certainty, the garment of everything. And what remains is just the quiet, the ancient quiet that was here before the stories, before the tablets, before the arguments about who was right. Just the quiet, and your breathing, and the faintest echo of a story that's been travelling for 4,000 years to reach you tonight. And in that quiet, there's one more thing worth holding gently before you let it go too. Acquisition and breath. We've travelled a long way tonight. From a clay tablet buried beneath desert sand, to the reading room of a museum where a man couldn't contain his joy. From the cooperation of 2 ancient brothers, to the violence that memory added. From the first gate to the 7th. And now, in the quiet that follows the descent, there's something worth holding for a moment, before you let it go. We spend our lives trying to be Qayin, building, acquiring, holding on, putting down roots, making things that will outlast us. Careers, homes, relationships, reputations, systems that will keep running after we've stopped. We build walls against the weather. We build savings against uncertainty. We build routines against the chaos of being alive. And all of it, every wall, every plan, every carefully constructed tomorrow is an act of faith that permanence is possible, that if we just hold tightly enough, the things we love will stay. But in the end, we are all Hevel, breath, vapor, something that appears for a moment, catches the light, and then passes. And here's the thing that stays with me long after the tablets are put away. That's not a tragedy. It's what makes the light worth catching. Abel's name means breath, and breath is not nothing. Breath is the most essential thing there is. Without it, all the walls and cities and bronze tools in the world are just objects in an empty room. Breath is what makes a house a home. Breath is what makes a story a voice. Breath is what you're doing right now, in the dark. While these ancient words drift past you, and Cain's name Qayin acquisition, the impulse to build, to craft, to leave a mark, that's not wrong either. Without it there would be no tablets, no cities, no museums, no quiet man hunched over a clay fragment, reading words that would change the world. The story was never about choosing one over the other. It was about what happens when we forget that both are necessary, when acquisition refuses to share, when breath is treated as less valuable than what can be held. And that boy in the Aduba, the one we met a long time ago, or what feels like a long time ago, sitting on a cool stone floor in Nippur, pressing his reed into wet clay by the light of a single flame, copying words he didn't fully understand, in a language that was already ancient in his own time. He was Qayin in that moment, making something permanent, building a record that would outlast empires, pressing meaning into mud so that it might survive the centuries. His hands were tired and the clay was getting firm, but he kept going, because his teacher said, every word matters. And he was also Hevel, a breath, a life, a boy whose name we will never know. He finished his lesson and walked out into a Sumerian evening. The sky enormous above the flat Euphrates plain, the smell of river water and baking bread, the sound of voices he loved, calling him home. He lived a life that left no trace except these words, these marks in clay carried forward by other hands, other voices, other students on other floors, in cities that would rise and fall and be forgotten and be found again. His tablet survived. His breath didn't, but his breath is what gave the tablet its meaning. Without the living hand, the clay is just clay. Without the breath behind the stylus, the marks are just marks. 4,000 years, and his words are here tonight, in the dark, with you. And George Smith, the quiet banknote engraver who read a tablet and began to take off his clothes with joy in the reading room of the British Museum. He understood something in that moment, something that most of us spend our whole lives trying to learn, that the past isn't gone. It's just been waiting for someone patient enough, curious enough, alive enough to listen. And when he listened, when those 4,000-year-old marks resolved into words, and those words told a story, he recognized the distance between then and now collapsed. And he couldn't contain it, because what he found was not just history, it was a voice, still breathing, after all that time. Think of all the people between that Sumerian scribe and you. Thousands of years of hands copying, voices telling, memories reshaping. Akkadian scribes in Babylon, translating from a language that was already dying. Hebrew scholars in exile, surrounded by tablets that looked like their own stories, seen through a strange mirror. Greek travelers who heard whispers of older civilizations, medieval monks who copied what they could save, Victorian archaeologists with scraped knees, quiet museum workers who couldn't keep their clothes on, each one adding something, each one changing the story slightly, until the cooperation became a taking of life, until the murder that memory added, but also each one keeping the story alive, each one deciding, this matters, this is worth carrying forward. This question, how do we live together when our ways of surviving are so different, is worth asking again. And tonight, someone lies in the dark and hears the older version, the version where no one takes a life, where farmer and shepherd share water, where the oldest answer to the oldest question was, why should I compete with you? Maybe that's the version worth carrying into sleep. Here's the thing about fingerprints. They don't tell you everything. They tell you someone was there, someone touched this, someone cared enough to leave a mark. The fingerprints on this story, the marks left by 4,000 years of human hands, don't give us certainty. Not about when or why the cooperation became violence, but they tell us something more important, that people were there, at every stage, making choices about what to keep and what to change, and that the story in every version was worth telling. That's enough. That's more than enough. And now, the story is almost done. We began tonight with a clay tablet, no bigger than your hand, buried beneath desert sand for 4,000 years, and on it, pressed into the surface by a reed held in a living hand, a story, not of taking life, not of jealousy, not of a field where only one brother walks away, but of two people who found a way to share the same earth, a farmer and a shepherd, one who builds and one who moves, one who holds and one who breathes, and between them, a goddess who loved them both. And the farmer said, why should I compete with you? Your sheep can graze my fields, your flocks can drink from my canals. And the shepherd said, come to my wedding feast. And they sat down together. That was the oldest version, pressed into clay, carried forward through centuries of copying, by students who didn't understand every word, but copied them anyway, because someone told them, these words matter. And 1,000 years later, after trade routes and conquering armies and exile and transformation, the story changed. The cooperation became a taking of life, the shared table became a silent field, and the question, why should I compete with you, became, am I my brother's keeper? The murder that memory added. Maybe the later version is more honest about what humans are capable of. Maybe the earlier version is more honest about what humans are capable of, at their best. Maybe both are true. Maybe that's the whole point. 4,000 years. And the question hasn't changed. How do we live together when our ways of surviving are so different? The tablets don't answer it. Genesis doesn't answer it. And neither can I. But the fact that we keep asking the fact that a story told on clay 4,000 years ago can still make someone think, still make someone feel something in the dark, at whatever hour it is, wherever they are, that means the question is alive. And as long as the question is alive, the answer is still possible. If this journey meant something to you tonight, if any part of it made you think, or wonder, or drift for a moment into a world that smelled of wet clay and lamp oil and desert wind, maybe leave a note. Tell me where you are, what time it is. I always read them. And now, wherever you are tonight, whether it's midnight or nearly dawn, whether you heard every word or drifted in and out, that's exactly right. That's what the story is for. Not to be consumed, to be breathed. The tablets have said what they came to say. The gates are closed behind you. Every assumption you carried in has been gently set down. The crown, the necklace, the armor, the gold, the certainty, the garment, all left at gates you've already passed through. And what remains is what was always underneath, before the stories, before the tablets, before the arguments about which version is right. Just the quiet. And your breathing, and somewhere, 4,000 years away, a boy finishing his lesson on a cool stone floor, walking out into a Sumerian evening, looking up at the same stars you can't see right now because your eyes are closed, but they're there, the same ones, still. The story will be here. It's been here for 4,000 years. It can wait for you. So let the gates close behind you. Let the clay return to the earth. Let the names settle into silence. Qayin, acquisition. What we try to hold. Hevel, breath. What passes through. Both beautiful, both necessary, both yours. The farmer and the shepherd found a way to share the same earth. And tonight, in the dark, so did you. The voices fade now into the ancient quiet. That was here before the stories, before the tablets, before the first question. Rest well. Good night.